So, there's a lot of new faces, so wonderful to see you all here. Is it recording, Osama? Excellent. So, what's going to happen today is we're going to read through a poem of Allama Iqbal's, and through this poem we're going to explore some themes in his poetry, and I've also snuck in a bit of another poem at the end. This poem is shorter than last week and the week before, so inshallah we'll finish up quicker. So who here doesn't know who Allama Iqbal is or hasn't heard of Iqbal before beyond just a name? Okay, I anticipated this. So, Allama Iqbal basically is one of the 20th century's most important Muslims. And he was born sort of 1870 in British-controlled India. And he died in 1936 or 1937, also in British-controlled India. And, 38, my apologies. And this is a wonderful picture of Iqbal, very man of grace and poise and fashion and intelligence, but also a very funny man. So Iqbal was a poet, Iqbal was a philosopher, Iqbal was a politician, Iqbal was a lawyer. Very multifaceted person. And he was someone who combined the faculties of being a very good poet, so aesthetic faculties, with those of being a deeply, deeply spiritual man, with those of being a very philosophical man, with those of being a man who was very aware and concerned about the world around him. So he combined poetry with philosophy, with politics, with these three. So very, very multifaceted, very unique figure in Muslim history. So we've had great poets, we've had great politicians, we've had philosophers, but few of them have managed to combine all three. So that really marks out Iqbal. And Iqbal wrote in English, and in Urdu, and in Persian, and a little bit in Punjabi. So what I want to do is I want to also humanize Iqbal a bit. So we're going to read a first-hand account of Allama Iqbal's personality before we get into the poetry. So who here knows who Muhammad Asad was? Muhammad Asad. So Muhammad Asad is one of these wonderful 20th century Muslims. He was a Jew born in Europe, and he converted to Islam. And he was an incredibly brilliant mind who was able to understand both Europe and both the Islamic world. So in his autobiography, part 2, Muhammad Asad writes about meeting Iqbal because they were good friends. So Asad says, "The trait which distinguished Iqbal more than anything else was his inner quiet. Here was a man entirely at peace within himself and with God. A man who almost always spoke softly, often with a sweet, slow smile playing around his lips and lighting up his face. Indeed, he liked to smile on the least occasion, betraying a nature without guile and without rancor. And so one could easily understand why so many people regarded him not only with deep respect, but also with love. Everyone with whom he conversed was made to feel as if he were the person most important to him in all the world. And that was the reason why he was listened to by all who knew him, as no other man was listened to in his time." So Iqbal's influence is very far-ranging. He obviously left a deep imprint in the subcontinent, but he wrote extensively about affairs in Afghanistan and Central Asia. His imprint is deeply felt in Iran, as well as the Arab world, and even the Malay world, Indonesia and Malaysia. So a really important figure, and Sheikh Zahir has been very kind to give me this platform wherein I can share Iqbal with you. So us Desis, we sort of know who Iqbal is. We kind of grew up with Iqbal, especially if you're from Pakistan. But it's important that more and more people who are non-Desi and other young people, especially in Australia, know about Iqbal, because his message is so relevant and so pertinent. In fact, more relevant and more pertinent today than perhaps it was 100 years ago, or equally as relevant at least. So in this poem, this poem is called A Message to the Muslim Youth. of course, and he's sort of addressing Muslim youth in an atmosphere where Muslims are pretty like down on their luck, pretty down in the dumps. 100 years ago, it's the height of colonialism, it's the height of Western imperialism, it's the height of Western intellectualism. So it's very hard to resist the allure of the West, basically. And Iqbal is, seeing young people around him and people of his generation, becoming secularized or leaving Islam. So this kind of rhetoric that we'll see in this poem is addressing that context. Now, the reason these people are leaving Islam or are otherwise, disenfranchised is it seems like the West is winning and it just keeps winning. So from the mid-1800s, that's when European powers really get their claws stuck into the Muslim world, in Algeria, in India, in Indonesia, and other places, and they win, and they just keep winning. And so it's this question in the minds of people. It's like, what are we doing wrong? What's going wrong? It's very easy to be proud of the side that's winning, but it's much harder to be on the side that's sort of receiving everything.
That's what he was talking about in Shikwa.
Yes, exactly. So he has this epic poem called Shikwa, called The Complaint, where he dialogues, he converses with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he addresses these themes. So this is a sort of coming off the back of Shikwa and other poems like that. Okay, so we'll get reading, and the way it will work is I will read an Urdu couplet, and Farzad, whose name I have asked for the 7th time, I think, will read the English translation. Okay, Bismillah. Kabhi e naujawan Muslim, kabhi e naujawan Muslim, tadabbir bhi kiya tune, wo kya girdun tha, tu jiska hai toota hua sitara.
Have you ever pondered, Muslim youth, what is this world in which you are but a broken star?
तुझे इस कौम ने पाला है आगोश मोहब्बत में, कुचल डाला था जिसने पाँव में ताज सरे दारा.
You came from a nation that nourished you in an embrace of love, that nation which trampled under its feet the crown of Darius.
Mm-hmm. So, O Muslim youth, have you ever actually thought about why we're in this situation we're in? Why are we this broken star? And in maybe Masjid al-Qurtuba, Iqbal talks about the Muslims as a far away, diminished star. So Iqbal loves cosmic metaphors. Maybe one of the next sessions we can explore that in depth. So he says that you come from a nation that nourished you in an embrace of love. What is this nation that Iqbal is talking about? Please contribute and let's make this a dialogue. Ji. The Muslim nation, right? And what is this crown of Darius here that he refers to?
Darius was actually, there was one of the greatest state in Paris, in Iran in ancient time. It was I think around 500 years BC. So this state was set up by the Cyrus the Great. The Cyrus the Great is the one the Jews very admire him because he released him from the prison. So Cyrus the Great was the founder of this state. It's called as Hengamenshi state. So it's the Darius was the 3rd emperor of this state, and he's the only Persian king who was at his state was from starting from Greece to Egypt, Sudan, the current subcontinent, Sindh, Balochistan, and Egypt. So at one time he was a pharaoh. He was they call him Darius the Great. So it was one of the greatest state he has set up. So this was his crown was very famous, and it had become a symbol of the for the king. When Muslims conquered this Iranian state, so that crown of the Dara, they became in their possession. And there's a very famous event related to it. It was basically the tradition, the one who used to kill the person, the enemy, all his possessions and all his wealth used to come to the person who used to kill. So one of the Sahabi killed the king, and he was wearing Dara's crown. So that the Dara's crown came into his possession, and then he hit the crown because he didn't love it. He just
He kicked it.
yeah, kicked it towards the the far it away from it, and he said, I don't need this. So that's where Iqbal is actually relating to that. So your forefathers were the one who had kicked the crown of the Dara.
So the Persian Empire in its various iterations was one of the great world powers that had existed for 1,200 years before Islam came. And the other power was the Roman Empire, right? So Iqbal here is referring to the fact that when Islam came, it subsumed the Persian Empire, which is a very big deal for anyone who understands history, right, and geopolitics. There's another interesting couplet where Iqbal references the Crown of Dara. He says, "Ghairat badi cheez hai jahan tago do mein, penati hai darvesh ko taj sare dara." So honor is a very strange thing in this world of struggle. It puts the crown of Dara on the dervish. So these early Sahaba, they came and they saw this immense wealth and they had very little need for it. Now there's another thing happening in this couplet here. First he says, this nation nourished you in an embrace of love. And then we have quite violent, active imagery in the next couplet, trampled under its feet the crown of Darius. So what is this nation that nourishes its members in love, but then also tramples across the world? This is a very interesting dichotomy, right? Iqbal is saying something deep here about the spirit of Islam, I think, which is ultimately one of love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and wanting to be God conscious and purify the self. So this is the embrace of love. But at the same time, it's a religion that is very active in the world. It doesn't retreat from the world. And it takes a stand when it needs to take a stand. So this is the interesting dichotomy of Islam as a religion, as a philosophy, that other religions don't have. So for example, Buddhism, all about self-purification, nothing to do with the world. And Marxism, which is another religion, all about the world, nothing to do with self-purification. Okay. तमद्दुन आफरीन खल्लाक आईन जहानदारी वो सहराए अरब यानी शुतरबानों का गहवारा.
Creators of civilization, forgers of a world encompassing law, those camel-riding Arabs of the desert.
So this is of course a reference to the early Arabs. Now I want to also mention that, so here we have mention of creators of civilization. So here it says here that the nation which trampled under its feet the crown of Darius, and then the next line says creators of civilization. So there have been many people, many tribes, many groups in the world who have done lots of trampling, the Mongols and other sorts of groups, right? But very few of them have birthed civilizations. So this is very interesting. I want to read a quote from Iqbal, some of his English prose, where he says, if you ask me, he's writing in his diary by the way, if you ask me what is the most important event in the history of Islam, I shall say without any hesitation, the conquest of Persia. The conquest of Persia gave the Arabs not only a beautiful country, but an ancient civilization. Or more properly, a people who could make a new civilization with Semitic and Aryan material. So Semitic is kind of like this old word for the ethnicity and language of the Arabs, and Aryan is kind of a more outdated word now for the ethnicity and language of the Persians. Our Muslim civilization is a product of the cross-fertilization of these Semitic and Aryan ideas. It is a child who inherits the softness and refinement of his Aryan mother and the the sterling character, sterling I think here means like pure or proud or upright, sterling character of his Semitic father. But for the conquest of Persia, the civilization of Islam would have been one-sided. The conquest of Persia gave us what the conquest of Greece gave the Romans. So Islam is something that, it's a force that comes and it purifies human societies and purifies human civilizations and rids them of the dirt that gathers within. That's the true power of Islam. Does anyone have any thoughts or comments thus far? Okay, Bismillah, let's keep going. Sama al-fakru fakhri karaha shane imarat mein ba'ab o rang o khal o khat che hajat ruhe zebara.
Asceticism is my pride, mark the glory of their governance. What use does a beautiful face have for color and powder?
Right. So the trademark of these early Sahaba was our simplicity, our aestheticism is our pride. And that's what marked their governance. Here this is a reference to Hazrat Umar, Hazrat Usman, Hazrat Ali. And Iqbal here has quoted someone else's poetry in the second line, and it's a line in Farsi. It's a famous line of the poet Hafiz Shirazi, who was a famous Persian poet. And the line in full, or the couplet in full goes, Ze ishq na tamam ma, jamal yar mustaghna ast, ba'ab o rang o khal o khat, che hajat ruhe zebara. The beloved, the beauty of the beloved doesn't have need for our incomplete love. So our love is incomplete and immature and faulty, but this doesn't have any effect on the beauty of the beloved. A beautiful face has no need for powder and color and makeup. So Iqbal has like reinterpreted Hafiz Shirazi's poem and given it like a political or a modern interpretation. So the Jamal Yar, he was like the truth of Islam. So we're weak, we're deficient, us Muslims, right? But this does nothing for the haqq of Islam. It has no effect. The haqq is the haqq. This is what Iqbal is saying here.
This Fakri actually, he's mentioning about an event. That one Roman ambassador came to see to Hazrat Umar, the Caliph in the Medina, and he asked, where is the Caliph? So people took him and took outside the Medina, and they pointed towards the tree. And he saw that one person is sleeping under the tree with he had some that mud under his neck, and that he was using as a pillow, and he's sleeping there. So the person told him that that's our Caliph. So he was surprised. He has never seen such a simple person. That he said, "Are you crazy? This is your Caliph." So actually, that's how Hazrat Umar was. So it's and that's where he's relating to that. Even Al-Fakru Fakhri, he was the ruler of the biggest empire in that time, and he was sleeping under the tree with a brick under his neck using as a pillow.
Due to such character, one philosopher of Europe said that if there had been another Umar in the world, the entire world would have been an Islamic world. Due to these reasons.
Yeah. Okay. गदाई में भी तो अल्लाह वाले थे गुयूर इतने कि मुनइम को गदा के दर से बख्शिश का ना था यारा.
In simplicity, they retained their self-respect, such that a rich man had no one to give charity to.
So this is continuing that same theme from the last couplet. And I think the reference in the second line, such that a rich man had no one to give charity to, is that there was lots of charity being given, but people had such a sense of self-respect that they didn't necessarily want to take the charity. Again, a reference to the time of the early Sahaba. Okay. गर्ज क्या कहूँ तुझसे कि वो सहरा नशीं क्या थे, गर्ज में क्या कहूँ तुझसे कि वो सहरा नशी क्या थे, जहांगीर और जहांदार और जहां बां और जहां आरा.
In short, what else can I say about those desert dwellers? Those world Caesars, world keepers, world makers, and world adorners.
Aha, what a beautiful line. Those world Caesars, world keepers, world makers, world adorners, describing the different attributes of the early Muslims. By the way, when you recite, look up and okay. अगर चाहूं तो नक्शा खींच कर अल्फाज में रख दूं, मगर तेरे तखय्युल से फजूं तर है वो नज़ारा.
Were I to put this picture into words, this scene would still be beyond the limits of your imagination.
तुझे आबाद से अपने कोई निस्बत हो नहीं सकती, कि तू गुफ्तार वो किरदार, तू साबित वो सैयारा.
What connection could you have to your forefathers? For you utter words, they did deeds, they roamed and you are still.
This they roamed and you are still, tu guftar wo kirdar. Tu sabit wo sayara. I think this is also a deeper, there's a deeper meaning here where Iqbal is talking about how the early Muslims were very dynamic and creative in their thinking. So one of a really important theme in Iqbal's poetry is the importance of creativity and being and responding to sort of changing needs. So he felt that the Muslims of his time were sort of stuck and stagnant, and they were not really able to present an Islam that that the time demanded, in a sense, or things were changing so fast that they also needed to not update Islam, but make sure that Islam was, or that Muslims were up to the new challenges that had emerged. So the Sahaba had, they did some incredible ijtihad in all manner of theological and political issues, right? So, but Iqbal felt that the Muslims of his time were sort of stuck. So I think this is a deeper reference here to that.
Is it also referring to the fact that like the Arab people were nomadic and Bedouin people, and now they're kind of just like chilling in the desert?
I think it's more a reference to the fact that they were active and they strode across the world and they dominated, whereas the Muslims of Iqbal's time are sort of stuck and defeated. I think it's more a reference to that. Okay. गुमवा दी हमने जो आसलाफ से मिरास पाई थी, सुरैया से ज़मीन पर आसमान ने हमको दे मारा.
We have disgraced the heritage that our forebears won. The skies have thrown us down from the heavens to the earth.
Very powerful, very strong language. The skies themselves, destiny itself, has thrown us down. And Iqbal tells us the reason for being thrown down in the next couplet. So he says, हुकूमत का तो क्या रोना कि वो एक आर्जी शे थी, नहीं दुनिया के आईने मुसल्लम से कोई चारा.
Why weep over lost empires? For they were temporary playthings. There are certain laws of this world that determine rulership.
So Iqbal says, why weep over lost empires? Now it's easy for us to say, why weep over lost empires? But Iqbal literally saw these empires collapse in front of him. The Ottoman Empire, right? He lived in the aftermath of the downfall of the Mughal Sultanate. And he's saying, don't cry over these things. What happened was meant to happen because the people who ruled these empires have not followed certain laws of rulership. What are these laws? It's kind of like if you don't ensure justice and some measure of equity in your home, in your family, in your town, in your tribe, in your village, in the world, right? Whatever setup you have will collapse and be replaced by something that is more just, or that is just and equitable. Something that's just and equitable is stable. Something that's unjust and unequitable and cruel is always destined to collapse at some point. Basic rule, right? Love is a far more powerful universal force than coercion, right? Sadi Shirazi says, "In saadat bazore bazu nist." Abid knows what I'm talking about. In saadat Bazore bazu nist. This success doesn't come from by force. It comes, right? Comes by love. So this is what Iqbal is saying. He's that like we don't need to focus on what's gone, right? But if we're going to make something new, we need to ensure that it has the right foundations. Justice, equity. मगर वो इल्म के मोती किताबें अपने आबा की जो देखे उनको यूरोप में तो दिल होता है सेपारा. Sorry.
Yet those pearls of wisdom, those books of our forebears, to see them in Europe splinters the heart with grief.
This is one of my favorite lines. So Iqbal is someone who studied, I didn't mention this, but he studied in Cambridge. He did his master's in Cambridge and he did a PhD from Europe. So he was very well informed and understood Europe very well. He lived some of his life there and studied in Cambridge. Of course, he would have seen all the books of the Muslim world that had been taken and stolen. So this is like a literal reference, of course, but also it's more of a metaphorical reference because Europe, in so many ways, took the knowledge that the Muslims had developed and worked upon and sort of took it further. Of course, took it in some wrong directions, right? So the Enlightenment or kind of materialist kind of philosophy that, ejects the role of the soul and God in human life. But they still nonetheless had energy and built and progressed in a sense. So Iqbal is also talking about this aspect. And it's one of my favorite because I'm a student of history myself, and to study, for example, Mughal history, I will have to go to London to read the Mughal books, not necessarily Delhi or Lahore, which is like, well, why is it like that? Why do I need to go to the West to learn about my own heritage? So something's not right there, right? So this is what Iqbal is getting at here. Okay. Now he ends the poem with a Farsi couplet, and it's a brilliant couplet, and there's so many levels of interpretation here. He says, Ghani, roz siyah pir kana ra tamasha kun, ki noor didash roshan kunad chashme Zulaykha ra.
O Ghani, behold the darkened day of the Pir of Canaan, for the light of his eyes alights instead the gaze of Zulaykha.
So this couplet references the story of Hazrat Yusuf, right, in the Quran. And there are, so let's flesh this out. Why is Iqbal choosing to end the poem with this, right? First of all, Ghani is the title of another poet. So it's another quote. Ghani Kashmiri was a really famous Mughal poet who died around 1660. And Iqbal has taken his poem and put it here and sort of reinterpreted it. So there are three actors in this poem, right? Who is the Pir of Canaan, by the way? Who knows? Hazrat Yaqub, right? Pir means like elder or someone of respect. Yeah, so there's Hazrat Yaqub, there's Zulaykha, and the light of his eyes, this is a reference to Hazrat Yusuf. So there are three actors here, right? On one level, Iqbal is saying, Iqbal is referring back to the previous verse, the books, right? So the Pir Canaan is kind of like the Muslims or Muslim civilization, and the light of his eyes are the books that have gone and are now lightening the eyes of Zulaykha. Zulaykha here is a reference to sort of the West, right? So that's one way to read this. Another way to read this is the Pir of Canaan, again, is a metaphor for the Muslim world, a metaphor for tradition, right? And heritage and religion. Zulaykha is a metaphor for the West, materialism, atheism, right? All these sort of wrong and very, very problematic ways of understanding human existence and life. And the light of his eyes, Hazrat Yusuf himself, is the Muslim youth. So Iqbal is saying here, how bichara, how wretched has the Muslim heritage become. For its youth have deserted it and are now going and embedding themselves in the West, basically. So it's a very, very deep, very creative reinterpretation of Ghani Kashmiri's spiritual couplet.
I will also, there's another meaning of it, and that's very true for the current time. So we see that the brain drain, which is happening from our countries which are third world countries. So the third world countries, they educate their people, doctors, engineers, and all those, and then the West attracts them and drain them. So all those people and those intellectuals and those all skilled people who have been prepared by these third world countries, the West offers them more money, more lifestyle, and that's how the brain drain happens. So we can also take this compared to that side.
Yeah.
That Pir Conan or Yaqub is the these are the third world countries, are the Islamic countries, and their nur and their light is going towards the west, and it's lightening the Zulaikha's eyes in the west. So that's another meaning of this.
Yeah, one of the brilliant things about poetry, and poetry presented and explained well, is you're able to see so many different layers and ways of interpreting the poem. And poetry can do something so powerful in so little words, in a way that prose in volumes and volumes and volumes cannot. So here's an example. We've interpreted this poem in 4 different ways, of course. Ghani Kashmiri would have had his original take on it as well. Okay, now we're finished with this first poem, and I've just snuck in a bit of a second poem because I think it's also deeply relevant to the theme of message to the Muslim youth. So Iqbal elsewhere says, मुझे तहजीब हाजिर ने अता की है वो आज़ादी कि ज़ाहिर में तो आज़ादी है बातिन में गिरफ्तारी.
Modern civilization has granted me a freedom, which on the outside is liberation and on the inside is captivity.
तो ए मौला यसरिब आप मेरी चारा साजी कर, मेरी दानिश है अफरंगी, मेरा ईमान है जन्नारी.
O Master of Yathrib, show me the way, for my rationality is European and my faith Christian.
This is so relevant, subhanallah. Does anyone have any thoughts on the first couplet? Yeah. It preaches freedom, preaches equality, preaches all these various nice sounding principles. But at its core, the human is apparently free. The people here in these societies apparently have all these freedoms, and yet, if we look deeper, they are victims of their own nafs. They're trapped by their own nafs. And this is something so deep here that Iqbal has said. And Islam is a message of submission, right? Islam means submission. And we submit, and through submitting, we transcend our nafs. And yet, Western philosophy says, throw away all restraints and you'll be free, but yet this drowns the person in their nafs. So this is, I think, something very profound Iqbal is saying, very relevant.
Reminds me too of the quote, birds born in a cage think that freedom is a crime. It's just like they like to label things under freedom. It's like, oh, freedom, but really it's abortion. But they say freedom, oh, really like people who walk around carrying AR-15s. So it's just like crazy things that people are doing, or sexual liberation, things like that. But they label it differently, and then it creates a different perception in your mind. Like for example, our concept of slavery in Islam, slaves have more rights than people do today in the West. Yet, our perception, our reality is not their perception. So these terms or a lot of the words that we're using to, I guess you could say, manipulate the way that we think is not always accurate when you look into it.
This is a very deep reflection on the promises of sort of Western civilization that Iqbal is able to see through 100 years ago. It's easier for us now to see through this because Western civilization has sort of discredited itself through the events of the 20th century, the First and Second World Wars, and the rise of postmodernism. But Iqbal is seeing all this in like 1910, which is, yes.
Was this prominent in Iqbal's time?
What do you mean?
The same, his quote, that's affecting today. Was it prominent in his time?
Yeah, I mean, like the Europeans ruled India, right? So their ideas, their way of thinking was
But weren't they following Christianity?
They were following Christianity, but then there were a lot of, he explains this in the next one actually, there were a lot of Muslims who overtly or inadvertently became very affected by sort of the ideas that were being presented. Some of them just left Islam completely, but some of them, they started presenting Islam in ways that maybe the Prophet wouldn't even recognize. Okay, let's read the last verse. So, we already did, right? Yeah. So, my apologies. So, this is what he's getting at here. Save me, O Prophet, show me the way. My intelligence, my aql, my rationality has become European. My faith has become Christian. So, what does it mean for faith to become Christian? What is Iqbal saying here? Anyone have any thoughts?
It's being made like moderate or like progressive.
Sure, that's one way to look at it, for sure. Christians have a more relaxed approach, or they sort of divide up the way they see the world, or their religion in sort of these neat boxes, and it's like, okay, this is the religion box, and this is the politics box, and this is the economics box, and that sort of has rendered Christianity and Christians a sort of seriously about this. Whereas for Christians, it's like, no, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and God unto God's, and they're separate, and that hasn't exactly gotten the West very far in ethical terms, I think. And rationality being European, again, is a reference to overemphasizing sort of maybe sort of, like a, although that's not to say evidence-based perspectives are non-Islamic, but one of the more difficult things to understand about living in our world today is when there's a particular philosophy that's the default philosophy, it's very hard to understand its assumptions. And there are certain key assumptions in sort of like Western civilization about how we should think and how we should think about ways of thinking that are far from Orthodox Islam, I think. Okay, so one example of that, I should be more concrete, right? Is this idea of do what you like as long as you don't hurt anyone else. This is like a core maxim of Western life, civilization, I guess. Do what you want as long as you don't hurt anyone else, which sounds nice on the outside. But of course, as Muslims, we have a kind of a more different perspective to that. We recognize that harm is not just a physical thing. There are different kinds of harm. There's spiritual harm, and there's harm to the community at whole. And so we have a different way of addressing this. Another maxim of the modern West is love, right? Which is a very powerful phrase used to justify the normalization of homosexuality or transgenderism or who knows what next, right? Love is love. And it's like, yeah, love is love. Why would I be against that? It's very, like, it puts you as a Muslim in a very sort of awkward position. What do you mean you don't love? What kind of monster are you? But when we actually unpack the assumptions of this love is love statement, we'll realize that there are deep contradictions. It's a big topic, but this is what Iqbal is getting at. My rationality is European, my faith Christian. Subhanallah. Okay, now what are some lessons that we can take away from reading this, sort of practical lessons to think about in our lives today? Does anyone have any ideas?
I like the quote
Yeah.
second last one,
Mhm.
says why we overlook lost empires,
Mm.
the temporary takings.
Mm.
There are certain laws of this world that determine rulership.
Mm.
I feel like it's inferring that those who are in power, like they know how the game's played at this stage, so they'll be in power for a bit more time.
Okay, sure. That's one way to look at it for sure. Yes.
There's a sort of like indescribable picture that is painted of the past when it comes to the Islamic history and the history of the Sahaba, where what they accomplished is so grand and magnificent for the entire world that exactly no words that he can make will ever do justice to what actually happened, and that it did set like a series of benchmarks maybe for what we can achieve as an empire, as a nation. However, we have fallen short of this since then, and it leaves a feeling of what kind of feeling does that leave within the person today? It's put throughout the poem, but it's not a good one. You know, it's like it's you want to say it's like nostalgia with like some sadness behind it, or some loneliness even. That we don't have these great grand times anymore. It's just we have to live in this freedom, which is captivity on the inside, and subtle about it. It's captivity.
So, remember Iqbal, there's this sadness, sorry to interrupt, there's this sadness, there's this nostalgia, but Iqbal is also, what makes him so unique is that he's this poet of empowerment as well. And we discussed in our first session his philosophy of khudi. Iqbal says, have a sense of khudi. Khudi is a sense of self-respect and a sense of dignity grounded in God consciousness. So Iqbal says, yeah, things are bad, we can do better. This is how to do better. First step, change your psychology. Thank you. Ji?
Iqbal actually at this point, Iqbal is trying to will give a message to the youth, and he's trying to compare the youth with their forefathers. And it's not a nostalgia. Iqbal's unique thing about Iqbal is that he creates a message from the past. So he thinks that the past is not only the past. Past is a way to move forward. That's most important thing about Iqbal. And for me, the most important thing is in this poem is the knowledge. And Iqbal says himself that हुकूमत का तो क्या रोना कि वो एक आर्जी शय थी. So he says that I'm not worried about the government. I'm not worried about my the country, and I'm not worried about that we have lost the empire. I'm more worried about the knowledge which we have lost. So the nations are built on the knowledge, not on the states.
Right.
And that's what he's giving the message, and that's why he has brought the Ghani's couplet as well. That the brain drain is the one which is damaging us more than anything else. So if we want to lift ourselves again and come to that stage again, we have to improve our knowledge. We have to get our knowledge back. That's what I get the message from.
Yes.
To my mind, the gist and substance of this entire poem is that, as you have spoken that very verse, that तुझे अपने आबा से कोई निस्बत हो नहीं सकती, तू गिरफ्तार वो किरदार तू साबित हो सही आ रहा. It means that we should follow our forefathers' instances, what they had did. We should be practical, not a theoretical. Our Muslims today, we are only theoretical that we should do. We should do something practical. As someone has said that the instances of our forefathers can make our lives sublime if we follow the principles of our forefathers.
Sure.
Thank you.
So Iqbal takes.
Sorry, I have disturbed you.
No. Thank you so much. So Iqbal takes the Islamic tradition seriously. There are a lot of Muslim groups today that preach a message of revival, but they sort of ignore Muslim history and they kind of paint a very mythical picture of the past. And they're actually more modern and sort of European in their rationality than they're ready to admit. But Iqbal says, no, we need to take the Muslim tradition seriously. So he quotes Hafiz, he quotes Ghani, he mourns these lost books of knowledge. So for us going forward, we need to learn about the Muslim tradition, learn about Muslim history in a mature, thoughtful way. Learn our languages, learn your Arabic or your Farsi or Urdu or whatever it is, because that's how you'll actually tap back into that tradition. And lastly, of course, there's this message of faqr, asceticism, simplicity. Whatever you do, live simply, live righteously, live justly, and don't let the dunya trap you, right? So that's also a very important practical message for us here. Okay, if that's everything, thank you all so much for coming in. Yes?
When at the end of the last couplet,
Yes.
at the start, it says, "O Master of Yathrib."
Yes.
Is that referring to God?
No, Yathrib is the old name for Medina.
Medina,
So it's referring to the Prophet.
oh,
O Prophet.
yes.
So here he's saying, O Prophet, show me the way. So we need to sort of look and understand the Prophet's way.
Right.
That's what he's saying here.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a reference to that.
Okay.
Yeah. There are some Muslims who try and bypass the Prophet and the Sunnah entirely. We call them Quranists, and they say, no, we can read the Quran by itself and understand it. There's a lot of problems with that. So Iqbal disagrees with that view. He says, no, we need to look at the Sunnah, but in a thoughtful and conscious way, not necessarily blind imitation.
I think that's put forward at the start with the first line. Have you ever pondered? First line is kind of like an instruction.
Exactly. Okay, thank you everyone for attending. I hope you found it beneficial. Tell your friends, come back next week, inshallah. Okay. Can you stop that?
Yeah, timed out.